A princess, a secret, and a trail leading to Palermo's shadows. Welcome to Mystery Parlor. I am your host, Axon. Share where you're watching from. Your comments make these mysteries come alive. Let's get started. You'd think a brownstone on West 35th Street would be immune to fairy tales. It's not. That morning started like most others. Me balancing the day's mail with one hand, and Fritz's coffee with the other, and Wolfe doing his best impression of an immovable mountain in the office chair. If the world tilted off its axis, Wolfe would merely complain about the orchid's humidity. At 11 o'clock sharp, the doorbell rang. Not unusual. What was unusual was the knock that followed. Sharp, deliberate, like someone spelling their name in Morse code. I opened the door to find a woman who wasn't from this borough or any other that respects subway grime. She had an air that suggested Palermo, Italy, or at least an expensive imagination of it, draped in a sapphire coat and a veil too dramatic for Broadway matinees. "Mr. Nero Wolfe," she said, accent polished but still leaning Mediterranean. "I must see him." "It is urgent. I've seen urgent. It usually comes with mussed hair, uneven breathing, and a detective following behind with a notebook." This was the opposite. She was cool, deliberate, and carried urgency the way some women carry a clutch. I asked her name. "I am Princess Livia of Palermo." I didn't laugh, though it was close. Instead, I gave her my best neutral arch and escorted her into the office. Wolfe didn't rise, of course. He merely let his lips compress into that straight line that means, "Archie, what has the wind blown in now?" She stood in front of his desk, uninvited but unmoving, and declared, "Someone I trusted has betrayed me. I need you to find out who." That got Wolfe's eyebrows in motion, which is the equivalent of most men leaping on their chairs. "You're a princess?" Wolfe said, the words rolling out with skepticism measured to the ounce. "Of Palermo?" "Yes." "Preposterous," he muttered, and reached for a beer. Now most people would have wilted under Wolfe's dismissal, not her. She merely drew off her gloves, slow and deliberate, and placed them on his desk as if it were a coronation altar. "It is not my title that matters," she said. "It is the theft. A theft of letters, of promises, of leverage. Without them, my reputation, and perhaps my future, is compromised. You are said to be immovable." I require that I glanced at Wolfe. He wasn't looking at her, not directly. He was studying her gloves as if they were a foreign species he needed to classify before lunch. Then, without warning, he said, "Archie, get her particulars." That meant one thing. Against his own inertia, Wolfe had already decided. And me? I smelled trouble coming in layers. Perfumed, aristocratic, and possibly armed with more lies than truth. I closed the door behind me, and for a moment the room settled into that familiar, almost oppressive quiet, the kind that hangs in the air when Wolfe is about to speak. He took his time with the beer, the glass clinking as he poured it slowly, deliberately. I wasn't in a hurry either. My instincts were telling me this woman wasn't here for a chat about local charities. She stood rigidly in front of the desk, hands clasped neatly in front of her, eyes focused somewhere beyond Wolfe. She wasn't nervous, not even slightly. In fact, if anything, she looked like someone who expected things to happen on their own terms. I wasn't about to tell her how hard it was to get Wolfe's attention. She was learning fast. Wolfe's gaze flicked to her, then down at the gloves she had placed on his desk as though they were an offering, a symbol of her seriousness. He took a long sip from his beer before speaking again, each word measured. "You've not come to discuss the weather. Nor, I suspect, to inquire about my orchids." Her lips twitched, just barely. "No, Mr. Wolfe. My problem is far less trivial than that, perhaps," Wolfe said, his voice dripping with the kind of indifference only he could perfect. "But you have yet to explain why a princess would seek the services of a private detective in New York." The city is full of colorful people. You are hardly unique, despite the drama you carry with you. She wasn't put off. Not even by the jab about her dramatic entrance. I came because you are said to be, how should I put it, untouchable. In a city like this, that is invaluable. There was a pause, long enough for the silence to prick at the edges of the room. It wasn't exactly a compliment, but she wasn't here to flatter Wolfe. She was here for something else, something deeper. I waited for it to surface, but it seemed like she was in no rush. The letters, she said finally, her eyes narrowing slightly, were taken from my residence in Palermo under the guise of an invitation. Invitations that led to trust, and then betrayal. They were of great importance, Mr. Wolfe. Not just to me, but to my family. There are those who wish to see me fail. I need to know who. That is why I came. Wolfe's eyes softened as he processed the information, the usual skepticism replaced by something darker, more assessing. You say these letters are of importance. How? They contain agreements, she said, her voice colder now, controlled. Secrets of a deal I made with a rival family. If they are exposed, it will destroy everything I've worked for. And possibly much more. I watched her carefully. She wasn't a stranger to danger. I could see that in the way she held herself. But there was something odd about her story. Something that didn't quite line up. I need your assurance that you will not waste time asking questions about things that do not matter, she added, her voice crisp now, as if rehearsed. I only want the truth of who took them. No more, no less. Wolfe tilted his head. I knew what that meant. His brain was already turning, making calculations and deductions, reading between the lines of her words. He placed the beer bottle back on the desk, gave her one last, appraising look, and then, in his typically deliberate way, said, I will accept the case. But I will not operate on assurances, Princess. I will operate on facts. And as for your so-called rivals, you'll find that I care very little for their petty schemes, no matter how much wealth or titles they possess. She didn't flinch. I almost admired her for that. I'm afraid you have no choice, Mr. Wolfe, she said, lowering her gaze to the gloves again, as though the conversation had already moved beyond them. Once you accept, you're bound by your word. There was a slight undercurrent in her voice. She was staking her claim in the room, whether Wolfe liked it or not. I moved closer to the desk, watching her carefully. Wolfe glanced at me, giving his subtle signal, the one that meant he was already thinking. Then we begin, he said, his voice turning steely. I'll need a list of everyone who could have known of these letters and the means by which they were taken. Details, Princess. Nothing vague. Her eyes locked with his then, and for the first time I saw something behind her gaze, something calculated. I'll give you everything, she said, but I warn you, Mr. Wolfe, nothing is as it seems. I left her with Wolfe to deal with the specifics, though I knew I'd be following up soon. When the door closed behind me, I found myself wondering just how tangled this web was. I'd be lying if I said I didn't smell something fishy. Wolfe had that look in his eyes, the one that meant he was already several moves ahead, and I wasn't about to interrupt his train of thought. But I wasn't going to wait around forever, either. I needed to dig into this before the trail went cold. I stepped out into the hall and dialed Saul Panzer. Wolfe had given me the go-ahead, but I wasn't blind to the fact that something about this case didn't sit right with me. Saul was good at sniffing out motives, even when they were wrapped in high-end silk. When he picked up, I didn't waste time. Saul, we've got a situation. Palermo, Princess, and a missing set of letters that could bring down more than one empire. You're going to want to start looking into anyone who might have had access to her life in New York before she showed up. Saul was silent for a beat, then said, I'll get on it, Goodwin. This could be a mess, but I'll keep my ears open. Good. Saul had a nose for the right things. I'd need that, because in my gut, I was already starting to feel like this was more than just a simple theft. It wasn't long before Saul's call came through. I was pacing the hallway outside the office when the phone buzzed in my pocket. The fact that it was Saul, and not the usual string of underworld contacts, meant something was moving. "Goodwin," he said without preamble, "I've got some things for you. First off, there's a slim crowd who knew the princess was in town before she arrived at the brownstone. Notably, a few old acquaintances of hers in the city, connections from her past, mostly from her father's days in business. But it's thin. The people she trusted, those who could have known about the letters, are either out of the loop or conveniently on vacation." "Convenient, huh?" I muttered, already starting to think about who was pulling those strings. Saul didn't need to hear me think aloud. He continued, unbothered. "There's also the matter of her timeline. She arrived in New York nearly a week ago, but her movements since then don't match up with what she told Wolfe. In fact, there's a discrepancy between the date she says she left Palermo and when she actually did. Small difference, but it could mean she wasn't quite as innocent as she made herself out to be." I leaned against the wall, turning the details over. It wasn't much, but it was enough to raise the hair on the back of my neck. This princess was starting to look more like a pawn than a player, but the game was still fuzzy. "So you're telling me her timing is off? Not just the letters, but the entire narrative?" "Exactly. There's also something odd about her father's estate records, the kind of odd that only shows up when someone's trying to hide something. I'm looking into it more." "Good," I said, already planning my next move. "Keep digging, Saul. I need you to get close to those vacationing friends of hers. There's a reason they've gone silent, and I'll get started on the list of suspects here." I hung up, slipping the phone back into my pocket, and stepped into the office. The door was closed, which meant Wolfe was in one of his moods. Sure enough, when I entered, he was sitting exactly where I'd left him, silent, contemplative, and studying a bowl of orchids as if it held the secrets of the universe. "You've had your meeting," Wolfe said without looking up. "What did you learn?" I took a moment to collect my thoughts. I had to be careful with Wolfe. Too much speculation too soon would only annoy him, and he'd be less inclined to trust my findings. "Not much yet," I replied, sitting across from him. "But Saul's got his eyes on some of the princess's friends, the ones who may or may not have known she was in town. It's a small circle, but there's something odd about her timeline." Wolfe's brow furrowed, but he didn't speak immediately. He was thinking, and when Wolfe thinks, it's always better to let him work without interruption. I could almost hear the gears turning in his head. Finally, he set the orchids down with a soft thud. "You are right to be suspicious, Archie," he said, his voice low and steady. "There is something about this woman that does not align with the details she's given us." I nodded, waiting for more. Wolfe wasn't one for half-baked theories. If he said something didn't align, it meant he had a reason. "You suspect something?" I ventured. "Not suspect, Archie," Wolfe corrected, leaning forward slightly. "I deduce. And what I deduce is that this is not merely a theft. If the princess's letters are as important as she claims, then someone has gone to great lengths to make sure she finds herself in a bind. But I am not convinced that it is her someone is trying to hurt. Number. I believe the target is someone else entirely." I sat back in my chair. This was new. Wolfe was usually as careful as a surgeon when it came to his conclusions. He didn't jump to wild ideas, and he didn't speak without certainty. "You think the letters were a decoy?" I asked slowly, the pieces starting to click into place. "Precisely." Wolfe's lips curved slightly at the edges. "This was a carefully constructed play. The princess is the pawn, and someone wants us to believe she is the victim. But that is the falsehood, Archie. There is something more at play here." I shifted forward, leaning in as Wolfe's eyes sharpened. This was the part I hated, when the ground beneath my feet started to feel a little too uncertain. "So what's the real story, then?" I asked. Wolfe steepled his fingers, eyes narrowing in thought. You'll need to find out who stands to benefit from the princess's downfall, who stands to gain by using her as a scapegoat in whatever game they are playing. You will begin by focusing on those individuals who are aware of her being in town. You have your task, Archie. Proceed with caution. It wasn't a command. It was a statement. Wolfe was sending me into the lion's den with just enough knowledge to get myself killed, but not enough to really understand the danger. He trusted me to figure it out. I didn't say anything else. I didn't need to. Wolfe had spoken, and his plan was set. I left the office and grabbed my coat. The day was still young, but it already felt heavy. There was something beneath the surface of this case that none of us had fully grasped yet, and I wasn't sure if I wanted to find out what it was. But Wolfe had made his move, and now it was my turn to take the next step. The city outside was bustling as usual, indifferent to the quiet storm that was beginning to brew in the brownstone. But I wasn't looking for anything ordinary today. I was looking for a key, something that would unlock this whole mess. And maybe, just maybe, I'd find it in the people who were closest to Princess Livia, the ones who thought they were safe hiding behind their facades. I made my way to the first on the list, one of the princess's so-called vacationing friends. Time to see what they were hiding. I headed out into the cold, my mind replaying the details of the case like a broken record. The city was its usual self, a cacophony of honking horns, rumbles of distant subway trains, and a general air of indifference that somehow made every moment seem fleeting, unimportant. But not today. Today, something was off, and I wasn't about to let it slip past me. I moved quickly through the streets, passing familiar shops and corner delis that seemed unaware of the game unfolding just a few blocks away. My first stop was the apartment of one of the princess's vacationing friends, a woman by the name of Isabella Vidal. According to Saul, she had been tight-lipped when it came to anything about the princess's arrival in New York, and I had a strong suspicion she was hiding more than just a simple case of misdirection. Isabella's apartment was on the Upper West Side, charmingly tucked away in an old brownstone. Its exterior painted the kind of faded blue that only old buildings in New York could claim. The building itself seemed harmless enough, but I knew better than to trust appearances. If there was something worth hiding, it would be in the details. I rang the bell, hands shoved deep in my coat pockets. It was just after 2. The kind of time when most people would be expecting the quiet that comes with a post-lunch lull. The door opened with a quickness that suggested she had been waiting for someone, though I wasn't sure if that someone was me. Isabella Vidal was everything you'd expect from someone tied to a princess, tall, dark-haired, and polished, with a smile that could charm the dirt off the streets. She wore a white cashmere sweater and a pair of slacks that screamed expensive, and I could see the faint traces of makeup from hours before still clinging to her skin. "Mr. Goodwin," she said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" I gave her my most disarming smile, one I had perfected over the years. "Miss Vidal, I'm here to ask you a few questions. I understand you know Princess Livia." Her eyes flickered, just the slightest hint of something passing behind them. I didn't miss it. She stepped aside and gestured me in, closing the door behind me with a soft click. "Please," she said, "come in. I didn't realize the princess had already involved you. What is it you need to know?" I took in the apartment as I moved through it. A well-kept living room, expensive taste without being ostentatious. The kind of space that told you someone had money but wasn't interested in showing it off. I had a feeling this wasn't a home, but a carefully constructed image. I was here to dismantle that image, piece by piece. "Just a few details," I said, settling into one of the armchairs. "I understand you and the princess go way back, is that right?" Isabella sat across from me, a little too comfortably, like she knew she was playing a part in a script she had read before. Yes, we've known each other for years. I would call us close. Why do you ask? I studied her carefully. She wasn't nervous, at least not outwardly, but there was a subtle edge to her demeanor, like she was carefully crafting each response. She was hiding something, and I had a feeling it wasn't just about the princess's letters. I'm just trying to piece things together, I said casually, leaning back. You see, there's something odd about the princess's timeline. According to what she's told us, she was in Palermo a lot longer than she actually was. We've got conflicting dates. That's where you come in. You were in contact with her, weren't you, before she arrived in New York? Her expression didn't change, but her hands tightened slightly around the edges of her glass of water. I haven't spoken to her directly in weeks, Mr. Goodwin. But of course, we do stay in touch. Letters, you know. The usual way of things when you're— She paused, as if measuring her words. When you're from the same circle of people. It wasn't much, but it was enough to push me forward. And what about the day she left Palermo? You knew she was leaving, didn't you? I saw her shift. Just a fraction, but it was there. Her gaze flickered to the window, the kind of unconscious movement people make when they're avoiding something. I'm afraid I can't recall the exact date, she said, the smile returning to her lips. The princess is always traveling. It's hard to keep track. She moves with purpose, and I'm sure you understand that some details are, well, unimportant. I didn't respond right away. Her attempt to steer the conversation was too smooth, too practiced. I had a hunch that the details she was brushing aside weren't as unimportant as she'd like to think. I leaned in a little closer. Miss Vidal, you and I both know that in this business, every detail matters, especially the ones people tried to hide. Her eyes locked with mine then, and for a brief moment I saw a flicker of real tension, like a mask that was just about to crack, but it didn't. She straightened up and set her glass down on the table. I really must insist, Mr. Goodwin, that you stop probing into areas that don't concern you. The princess has enough problems of her own without anyone making them worse. I let the silence linger. It was a tactic I'd learned from Wolfe, and it worked every time. Eventually, she gave in. Her shoulders dropped slightly, and she exhaled a little too sharply. I didn't mean to make it sound so serious, she said with an airy laugh. But the princess, she's not the person you think she is. She's not a victim, Mr. Goodwin. She's the one pulling the strings, and if you're smart, you'll stay out of this. I felt a chill settle in the room, as if the temperature had suddenly dropped. This wasn't just about letters anymore. It was about power. Real power. And someone, somewhere, was willing to make sure the princess's fall would be spectacular. I stood up, giving her one last look. Thank you for your time, miss. Vidal, I'll be in touch. She didn't respond, but I didn't need her to. I knew everything I needed to know. As I left the building, the pieces began to fall into place. Isabella Vidal had given me more than she realized. Her fear, her hesitation, her desperate attempt to protect the princess, all of it pointed to one thing. The game was far bigger than a simple case of stolen letters. The princess wasn't just the victim. She was the mastermind. And now I had to figure out why she had dragged me into her web. By the time I got back to the brownstone, the late afternoon light was slipping away, the shadows of the city stretching longer with every passing minute. The sense of urgency that had hung in the air all day hadn't dissipated. If anything, it had grown heavier, like the storm that had yet to break. I had a new understanding of the game, but it was still unclear who was playing it and with what stakes. I pushed open the door to the office and found Wolfe exactly where I'd left him, seated behind his desk, an orchid between his fingers as though it were a delicate piece of evidence. His expression was unreadable, which meant he had already drawn some conclusions. I didn't waste time. I spoke with Isabella Vidal, I said, sitting down across from him. And it's worse than I thought. She's protecting the princess. Or at least, that's how it looks. But she's also terrified of something bigger than just those letters. Wolfe didn't respond right away. He just sat there, turning the flower in his hand with deliberate slowness, as if the petals were somehow more important than anything I'd just said. "Interesting," he said after a long pause. "What did Miss Vidal have to say about the princess's situation?" I leaned forward. "Not much. She's playing it close to the chest, but she slipped once. Told me the princess wasn't the victim here. She's the one pulling the strings. That makes me think the letters weren't just stolen. This is a setup. Someone's been planning this from the beginning." Wolfe finally set the orchid down, his eyes narrowing. "So, the princess is the architect of her own downfall?" That's what Vidal hinted at. But it's still not clear why. I get the feeling that the princess needed those letters to stay hidden for something more than just personal security. She's making a play for something bigger. Wolfe paused, his gaze piercing through me. "Have you considered that Miss Vidal might not be the only one trying to protect the princess? Or perhaps manipulate the situation for her own ends?" I had, of course, but I hadn't said it out loud yet. "You think Vidal might be part of this? That she's playing both sides?" Wolfe's lips pressed into a thin line. "It's a distinct possibility. People, like Vidal, don't deal in absolutes. They balance on the edge of power, always trying to secure the best position. If she's involved with the princess, there's more at stake than just a few stolen letters." I digested this. It made sense. There had to be something else driving all of this, something bigger than just betrayal or simple theft. I was still missing a piece of the puzzle, though. "Wolfe," I said, leaning forward, "what do you think the princess is really after? If she's behind all this, what's the end game?" He didn't answer right away, instead focusing his attention on the orchid again. Then, after a long moment, he leaned back in his chair, his eyes gleaming with that familiar, sharp clarity. "You're not seeing the full picture, Archie. It's not about the letters, it's about power. The princess isn't just protecting herself. She's using this scheme to manipulate someone or something else. She needs the illusion of being a victim to position herself in a place of influence." I sat back, letting the weight of Wolfe's words settle. A political move? Possibly. But more likely, it's a personal one. Wolfe's eyes never left mine, and in them I saw a hint of something cold, something calculating. The game is being played on a much higher level than you've realized. But I don't think the princess is the one you need to focus on. It's the people around her, the ones who stand to gain from her fall, that are the key. I felt a chill go through me. It wasn't just the princess I needed to investigate. It was everyone in her circle, those who were willing to use her as a pawn in their own power plays. I had to dig deeper, start peeling back the layers of this facade. I stood up quickly, pacing the room. "So, what's our next step? How do we find out who's pulling the strings behind the princess?" Wolfe sat unmoving, his hands folded over his stomach. "You'll need to go back to the people closest to her. Those who seem too eager to offer help, too quick to distance themselves. Find out who has the most to gain from the princess's downfall, and you will find your true adversary. Start with Miss Vidal. She knows more than she's letting on. I suspect she's been playing a part in this far longer than she would like you to believe." I nodded, already feeling the familiar thrill of the chase. Wolfe was right. The game was much bigger than it appeared, and Vidal was no simple bystander. She had to know something more, something that could finally unravel this tangled mess. "I'll pay her another visit," I said, heading for the door. "This time I'll see if she cracks." Wolfe gave a slight nod but didn't say anything. He didn't need to. I knew what he expected from me. I left the office and headed straight for Vidal's apartment. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but there was still so much I didn't know. One thing was clear, though. Whoever was behind this game was playing for keeps, and the stakes were much higher than I had initially believed. As I made my way through the city, the weight of the investigation pressing down on me, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were all mere pawns in someone else's game. And sooner or later, Wolfe was going to find out who was really in control. The elevator ride up to Isabella Vidal's apartment felt longer than usual. The air in the cramped space was stifling, thick with the tension of what I already knew would be a difficult conversation. I had to be careful this time. Vidal wasn't as naive as she pretended to be. She was no amateur in the game of deception, and I wasn't going to walk into her trap again. When the door opened, she greeted me with that same practiced smile, but this time there was something different in her eyes, something almost wary. I had no doubt that she'd been expecting me. The question was, what had she prepared for me this time? "Mr. Goodwin," she said, her voice as smooth as it had been earlier, but with a hint of something else, a note of caution that hadn't been there before. "Back again so soon? I do hope you aren't thinking of troubling the princess further." I stepped inside without answering, keeping my expression neutral. "Not today, Ms. Vidal. I think we're past that." Her smile faltered just a fraction before she regained her composure. "I'm afraid I don't understand." I closed the door behind me and turned to face her. "You're too smart to pretend you don't know what's going on. The princess isn't the victim here, is she? She's been playing a game, and I think you've been playing along." Vidal didn't flinch, but I saw the tiniest shift in her posture. She'd been caught off guard, and she wasn't sure how to respond. That was the opening I needed. "I'm not here to accuse you, Ms. Vidal," I said, keeping my voice even. "But I know you're involved in something bigger than just hiding a few letters. You're protecting someone, and I think it's the princess, not the other way around. But there's more to this than just her. Someone else is pulling the strings. The question is, who?" She remained silent for a moment, her gaze never leaving mine. I could almost see the wheels turning in her mind as she weighed her options. Finally, she spoke, her voice low but firm. "Maybe you're right. Maybe I am protecting her. But it's not just for the reasons you think." She paused, as if measuring whether to reveal more. "The princess is complicated, Mr. Goodwin. She's not someone you can understand just by looking at her from the outside. There's a lot at stake for her, and for everyone around her." I raised an eyebrow. "So, what's at stake? What's she really after?" Vidal stepped closer to me, her movements careful and deliberate. "You don't know everything, Mr. Goodwin. The princess isn't just trying to manipulate people. She's trying to keep something from getting out. Something that could destroy everything she's worked for. Her reputation, her family, everything I took a step forward, narrowing my eyes. And you're involved in this somehow?" She hesitated before answering. "It's not just about her. It's about a lot of people, Mr. Goodwin, people who've been waiting for the right moment to strike. The letters, they're just the beginning. What they contain could change everything." I let that hang in the air for a moment, trying to process the weight of what she'd said. So it wasn't just about the letters, after all. There was something much deeper here, something far more dangerous. "Who are these people, Vidal?" I asked, my voice suddenly sharp. "Who are you protecting, and why are you so afraid to tell me?" For the first time, a flicker of real fear crossed her face, but it was quickly masked by a veil of indifference. "I can't tell you that. I won't. Some things are better left alone." I leaned in, my gaze intense. "You're too smart for that, Miss Vidal. I'm not leaving here until I know the truth. If you're hiding something, you'd better tell me now before I find it out the hard way." She took a step back, her face pale. "You don't know what you're asking for," she whispered, almost to herself. There are people in this city, people who will stop at nothing to get what they want. The princess might be the pawn in all this, but there are others who are far more dangerous, and they're already moving. I could feel the gravity of her words settling around me like a weight. Whoever these people were, they weren't playing by the same rules. I could sense the danger in the air, thick and tangible. This was more than just a case of a stolen set of letters. The stakes were far higher than I'd imagined. I straightened up, my mind racing with the possibilities. Who's pulling the strings, Vidal? Who's behind all of this? For the first time, she seemed to waver, like she was about to say something important, something that could shatter the whole case wide open. But then, just as quickly, she closed off again, her face hardening into the same mask of indifference. "I told you," she said coldly. "Some things are better left alone." I didn't push any further. I knew when to stop, for now anyway. But I wasn't finished with her, not by a long shot. There was something in her eyes, something that told me she knew exactly who was behind all of this. I turned to leave, but before I reached the door, she spoke again, her voice barely a whisper. "Be careful, mister. Goodwin, some games are played to the death." That was all I needed to hear. I left her apartment without another word, the weight of her warning settling in my chest. As I stepped out into the evening air, I felt the shift in the atmosphere. The game was changing, and this time it wasn't just about finding a thief. It was about stopping something far worse from happening. As I walked away from Isabella Vidal's apartment, the evening air hit me like a slap in the face, sharp and biting. Her warning echoed in my mind, bouncing around like an unwelcome echo. Some games are played to the death. It was clear that whatever was happening, whatever the princess was involved in, it was more than just petty manipulation. It was a battle for something far larger, and someone had already been making moves behind the scenes. I had no intention of stopping my investigation just because Vidal had gone quiet. In fact, I had a feeling I was getting closer to the truth. Wolfe had already given me the task of digging into the people closest to Princess Livia, and Vidal was clearly more entangled than she cared to admit. But there were more players in this game, and I needed to know who they were and what they stood to gain. The moment I stepped back into the brownstone, I found Wolfe exactly where I left him. The silence in the room was heavy, punctuated only by the sound of his chair creaking slightly as he leaned back. The orchids on the desk were now a backdrop to his contemplation, as always. "You were right," I said as I entered. "Vidal's hiding something. She's scared, Wolfe, and that means there's a lot more going on here than just the princess and her stolen letters." Wolfe didn't look up. "Continue." His voice was low, deliberate, the kind that made you feel the weight of his expectations. I gave him the details. "Vidal's protecting the princess, but she's also trying to protect herself. Whoever's behind all this is playing a very dangerous game, and I think the princess is more involved than we thought." Wolfe's brow furrowed slightly, but only slightly. He never gave away too much. "Go on." I leaned against the wall, rubbing my chin. "Vidal warned me. She said there are people in this city who will stop at nothing to get what they want, and that's when I realized it's not just the letters. There's a bigger play happening here, Wolfe. Someone's trying to use the princess as a pawn, and they've set up the perfect trap." Wolfe finally looked up from his orchids, eyes sharp as ever. "A trap? For whom, Archie?" I could feel the weight of his gaze on me, but I didn't break eye contact. "For everyone involved. The princess, Vidal, maybe even me. Whoever's behind this is trying to control the narrative, and if we don't find out who they are, they're going to pull off something that none of us are prepared for." Wolfe sat back in his chair, his fingers steepled in front of him. He was silent for a long time, as though weighing everything I had said. "You're missing something, Archie," he said finally, his voice taking on that calm, methodical tone I had come to expect. "The princess is not simply a pawn. She is a player, a very smart one at that. The The question is not whether she's being used, but how she intends to use the people around her. I blinked, taken aback. You think she's pulling the strings, Wolfe? Wolfe's lips curled into the faintest of smiles. Not entirely. But she is no mere victim in this case. She is positioning herself, and I suspect that Vidal is not the only one who has been led into a carefully constructed web. The game is much larger than any of us realize. It was starting to make sense, but the more I thought about it, the murkier it became. Wolfe was right. This wasn't just about the letters. There was a deeper game in play, and the princess was involved, but so was everyone around her, and someone, somewhere, was making sure all the pieces moved in the right direction. Where do we go from here, then? I asked, feeling the weight of the case pressing down on me. Who do we need to be watching? Wolfe leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing. You'll continue with Miss Vidal. I suspect that she knows more than she's letting on, and I believe she'll crack. She's trying to protect something, and she'll eventually give us what we need, whether she intends to or not. As for the princess, we will have to wait for her to make the next move. She will. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was the best one we had. I nodded, though I wasn't entirely satisfied. The pieces were still scattered, and Wolfe wasn't about to reveal everything until the moment was right. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized Wolfe was probably right. There was no quick solution to this, no simple answer, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was walking into something bigger than either of us could control. I turned to leave, but Wolfe's voice stopped me. Archie, he said, and his tone was different now, almost personal. You've been involved in more than one of my cases. But this one is different. Be careful. People in this city play dangerous games, and not all of them are as transparent as you might think. I nodded, though his words weighed heavily on me. Wolfe didn't often give advice unless it was necessary. As I walked out into the night, I couldn't help but feel like I was standing on the edge of something massive. Whoever was behind this, whoever was pulling the strings, had played their cards carefully. They weren't just setting up a fall for the princess, they were setting up a trap for everyone involved. And the more I dug, the more I realized that I was already deeper in than I'd ever expected. The only question now was whether I could get out in time to stop whatever was coming next. I woke up the next morning with that familiar tightness in my chest. It wasn't just the usual unease that comes with a complicated case. It was something deeper, a gut feeling that I had stepped too far into a game I didn't fully understand, and the rules were changing faster than I could follow. I dressed quickly and grabbed a coffee from the corner shop before heading back to the brownstone. Wolfe was already at his desk as usual. There was a certain rhythm to his mornings, the orchids, the beer, the silent observation, but today he didn't seem like he was waiting for me. He was already deep into something, flipping through some papers with the focus of a man who had just cracked a puzzle. I've been thinking, Wolfe said as I entered. He didn't look up from his papers. You're wasting time with Miss Vidal. I froze in place, the words catching me off guard. I'm wasting time. What do you mean? Wolfe finally looked up, his expression cold but thoughtful. She's already told you everything she can. She's protecting herself, yes, but also the princess. It's a dead end. You need to focus on the larger picture, Archie. The players who have more at stake. I was ready for this. I had suspected it for some time, but hearing it from Wolfe made it feel more real. So, what now? Who else do we need to focus on? Wolfe's eyes narrowed as he leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. The key is not just in the people surrounding the princess, but in what they all stand to lose. Find out who stands to benefit most if the princess were to fall. I nodded slowly, processing the shift in direction. This wasn't just about getting the princess out of the crosshairs. It was about finding out who would gain from her demise. That's what I've been trying to figure out, I said, already turning the possibilities over in my mind. But no one is acting alone here. They're all tied to something bigger, something in the background. Wolfe's lips curved into a faint smile. Exactly. This isn't a game of one player trying to defeat another. It's a web of interests, each pulling its own thread. The princess is the center, but someone is orchestrating the movements. You just need to find the puppet master. I ran a hand through my hair, feeling the pressure of the case building. And where do I start? Wolfe leaned forward slightly, his eyes sharp. You know who stands to gain from this. You've been avoiding the obvious. Go to her family, find out what their stakes are, what they've been hiding. They're the ones who will benefit most from her downfall. They are the ones pulling the strings through her. It was the simplest thing, and yet it had eluded me. The princess's family. They weren't just distant figures in this case. They were the ones with the real power. Right, I said, standing up, already making plans in my head. I'll get to work on that. Be careful, Archie, Wolfe said, his voice low, almost a warning. These people are dangerous. They've been setting this up for too long to let it fail now. If you're going to find the truth, you'll need to tread carefully. One wrong move, and it will be you in the trap. I nodded and turned to leave. But Wolfe's voice stopped me again. One more thing, Archie, he said, his tone sharp. The princess is playing a much deeper game than either of us expected. She's not just a pawn, and she's not just trying to save herself. She's positioning herself for something much larger. Keep that in mind. With those words hanging in the air, I left the office and headed out into the cold New York morning, feeling the weight of the case pressing down on me more than ever. Wolfe's words echoed in my mind as I made my way to the princess's family. I had no illusions about what I was walking into. I was heading straight for the heart of the web, and there was no way to know how deep the threads went. The address Wolfe had given me was a mansion in the Upper East Side, one of those places that had been built long before the city's skyline had started to change. It was a building that didn't need to be ostentatious. It was grand by virtue of its history. I rang the bell and waited, the quiet hum of the city around me making everything feel distant. The door opened after a moment, and a man in his early 60s greeted me. He was tall, well-dressed in an old-fashioned, understated way, and his eyes were sharp in a way that made me uncomfortable. "Mr. Goodwin," he said, his voice low but not unfriendly. "Come in. We've been expecting you." I stepped inside, already sensing the weight of the situation. The mansion was silent, the air thick with the kind of wealth that didn't need to be flaunted. I was in the lion's den now, and I couldn't help but wonder how much of what I had uncovered so far had been part of the plan all along. "I don't know what you're hoping to find here, Mr. Goodwin," the man said as we walked down a long, marble-lined hallway. "But I'll tell you now, you're looking in the wrong place." I looked at him, taking in his words. "We'll see about that," I said, my voice steady despite the tension I could feel building in the air. He smiled slightly, almost as if he knew something I didn't. And at that moment, I realized that this wasn't just a visit to gather information. It was a confrontation. And I wasn't walking out of here until I had answers. The man led me through the mansion's silent halls, his footsteps echoing on the marble floors like a reminder that I was no longer in familiar territory. He wasn't rushing, wasn't even walking particularly fast, as if he was trying to make me feel the weight of the space around us. The mansion had the air of old money, quiet, controlled, and imposing without effort. It wasn't the first time I'd been in a place like this, but something about the way he carried himself made it different. There was a hidden authority in his presence, a sense of power that didn't need to be flaunted. He stopped in front of a pair of large, dark wooden doors and turned to face me. "My name is Gabriel Caruso," he said, his tone still level, his gaze cool. "I know you're here about my daughter, but I'd appreciate it if you kept your investigation as quiet as possible. We've already had our share of attention from the wrong people." I met his gaze. not backing down. I'm not here to cause trouble, Mr. Caruso. I'm here to find the truth. You might not like what you find, but I'll uncover it either way. His eyes narrowed, but his lips barely twitched upward, as though he found my bluntness either amusing or irritating. Perhaps both. "We'll see," he said, before pushing the door open and stepping aside to let me in. The room was dimly lit, the heavy curtains drawn against the late morning sun. Inside, it felt colder than the rest of the mansion, like a place where important decisions were made, decisions that needed the silence and stillness to breathe. A large mahogany desk stood against the far wall with a few chairs placed in front of it. At the desk sat a woman, her features sharp and austere. She didn't look up when we entered, but her posture stiffened the moment she heard the door close. "This is my wife, Selina," Gabriel said, his voice almost like a warning. Selina Caruso raised her eyes to meet mine, and the intensity behind them was immediate and unmistakable. She was a woman who had learned long ago not to show weakness. There was no warmth, no softness in her stare, just a deep, calculated detachment, a mind sharpened by years of navigating a world where power was a currency and emotion was an expense. "I understand why you're here, Mr. Goodwin," Selina said, her voice low but clear. "But I think you should know, whatever you're searching for, it's already been found. And perhaps it's best that you stop now. I was no stranger to veiled threats, but this one had an edge to it. It wasn't the kind of threat made out of desperation. It was the kind made out of confidence. Confidence that they had the power to stop me. The problem was, I wasn't the type to back down. Not now. "I'm not stopping until I have the answers I need," I replied, meeting her gaze squarely. "And I think you already know that. The question is, what are you afraid I'm going to find?" There was a brief pause, and in that moment I thought I saw something flicker in her eyes. It was gone too quickly for me to pin down, but it was there. An emotion. Fear. Guilt. Something human that didn't fit the cold exterior she was projecting. Gabriel's voice broke the silence. "You're digging into matters that don't concern you, Goodwin. My daughter is in a difficult position, and it's one you don't fully understand. We've worked hard to protect her, and we won't let some outsider jeopardize everything we've built. I don't care about your wealth or your buildings, Mr. Caruso," I said, my voice steady. "I care about the truth. Your daughter is caught in something much bigger than she realizes, and I think you know that better than anyone." Selina's hands, which had been folded on the desk, tightened for a moment. The muscles in her jaw twitched. "You think you know everything," she said, her tone colder now, but there was an edge to it, a quiet undercurrent of something raw. "You think you've figured out who's behind all this. But you're wrong. The truth isn't something you can just dig up. Not in this world. You're in over your head." It was the closest she'd come to giving anything away, and I wasn't going to let it slide. "Then tell me, Mrs. Caruso. Tell me what's going on. Why is your daughter involved in something that's so dangerous? What's the real game here?" She didn't answer right away, and I could tell she was weighing her options, deciding whether or not to throw me a bone. Finally, after a long, heavy pause, she spoke again, this time with a touch of vulnerability in her voice that surprised me. "You think the princess is just some innocent victim in all this?" she asked, her gaze never leaving mine. "You're wrong. She's just as much a part of this as anyone else. She knows what she's doing. She's using us just as much as we're using her." That was a shift. It wasn't the answer I had expected, but it was one I could work with. "What do you mean by using?" I pressed. "Is this about more than just the letters?" "Because if it is, I'm already too deep to back out now." Selina's lips pressed together in a tight line, and she exchanged a glance with her husband. Gabriel's eyes were unreadable, but Selina's expression betrayed something else, a reluctance to say too much. Hesitation, but after a moment she spoke again, her voice quieter this time. "Your princess isn't the only one with something to lose," she said, almost as though she were confessing. "Everyone in this family has stakes in her downfall, but it's more than just business. It's about power, and it's about survival." I could feel the gravity of her words settling in the room. The pieces were starting to fit together, but the picture was still too blurry to see clearly. This was bigger than I thought, and every answer I uncovered only led to more questions. I took a step closer. "Who stands to gain the most, Mrs. Caruso? Who's really behind all of this?" She didn't answer. Instead, she stood up, her eyes now locked on me with the same cold resolve I'd seen when I first walked in. "You'll find the answer soon enough, Mr. Goodwin," she said, her voice clipped, "but I suggest you stop before it's too late." And with that, I realized I had reached the edge of something I couldn't back away from, not without losing everything. The Caruso mansion felt colder as I left the office. The door clicked shut behind me with a finality that made the whole encounter seem like it had been a warning more than a conversation. Selina's words hung in the air, thick with something I couldn't quite grasp. "Stop before it's too late." What exactly did she mean by that? And why did she sound so certain that I was already in too deep? As I descended the mansion's marble stairs, my mind raced through the pieces of the puzzle. The Carusos were no strangers to power, but it wasn't just the family's wealth that was at stake here. It was something deeper, something rooted in the kind of power that had little to do with money and everything to do with control. I was certain now that Princess Livia wasn't just an innocent pawn. She was a player in her own right, using the Carusos just as much as they were using her. But the key remained elusive. What exactly was the princess after, and how did her family fit into the grander scheme? And who else, if anyone, was part of this web? I stepped out into the crisp evening air, the cold biting at my skin, but it wasn't the weather that had me on edge. The feeling of being watched returned, only stronger now, sharper. Someone was following me. I didn't need to look over my shoulder to know. I'd picked up the faintest echo of footsteps in the distance. Steady, calculated, not hurried. Whoever it was knew I was aware of them. I took a few more steps, pretending to be lost in thought, before I turned down a narrow alley. The footsteps followed, unwavering. Then, without warning, I stopped and spun around, facing the shadowed figure just as he stepped into the light. It was Saul Panzer, looking as unruffled as always, his hands tucked into the pockets of his coat. He grinned at me, and I knew then that he had been trailing me for a while. "Don't look so surprised, Goodwin," he said, his voice low and conspiratorial. "You don't think I'd let you wander into this mess without keeping an eye on you, do you?" I sighed, leaning against the brick wall of the alley. "I thought you were supposed to be helping me, not following me around like a shadow." Saul's grin widened. "Well, someone has to, right? You've been poking around where you shouldn't. I'm just making sure you don't get yourself into more trouble than you can handle." I narrowed my eyes. "What do you know?" He stepped closer, his gaze darting around the alley as if making sure no one was listening. "The Carusos are involved in more than just protecting their daughter, Goodwin. I've been digging around, quietly, of course. They've got more skeletons in their closets than you'd ever believe. It's not just power they're after. There's a deal in the works, something that could shift the balance in their favor in a way that nobody sees coming." I raised an eyebrow, interested despite myself. "What kind of deal?" Saul hesitated, clearly weighing how much to reveal. "I'm not entirely sure yet. But it's big, and it involves more than just the princess. There's another player, someone who has been quietly pulling strings behind the scenes, and the Carusos are more desperate than they're letting on. They've been setting this up for a long time, and the letters you're looking for, they're part of the plan, but not in the way you think." The pieces were starting to shift, but they still didn't form a coherent picture. "Who else is involved?" I asked, my voice sharper now. "And what's this plan of theirs?" Saul shook his head, frustration creeping into his voice. I can't give you all the answers yet, Goodwin. But trust me on this. The Carusos aren't the only ones who stand to gain from all this, and whoever's behind this is playing a game that could end very badly if it goes unchecked. You need to watch your back. Things are moving faster than you realize. I ran a hand through my hair, trying to make sense of it all. So you think I'm just a pawn in their game too? You think I'm being used to get to something bigger? Saul's eyes met mine, his expression unreadable. I'm not saying that. But I am saying you're in deeper than you think. You're poking the hornet's nest, and sooner or later, something's going to sting. The real question is, are you prepared for what happens when everything unravels? I stood there for a moment, the weight of his words sinking in. This wasn't just about finding a thief or recovering letters anymore. The stakes had grown much higher. It was a game of power, manipulation, and control. And I was a player, whether I liked it or not. So, what do we do now? I asked, finally breaking the silence. Saul's grin returned, but it was less playful this time, more grim. We keep digging, Goodwin. You need to go back to the princess. I know you're not going to like it, but she's the key. She knows more than she's letting on, and if we're going to figure out what the Carusos are really up to, we need to hear it from her. I exhaled sharply, feeling the familiar tension in my shoulders. You're right. We've got no choice. I'll go back to her. But Saul, this time, we need to be ready for whatever comes next. Don't worry, Saul said, his tone more serious now. I'll be keeping an eye on things. Just be careful, Goodwin. This isn't a game anymore. As I turned back toward the brown stone, the weight of everything that had been said settled over me like a fog. There was more going on than I had imagined, and the clock was ticking. Whoever was behind all this had already set things in motion, and it was only a matter of time before everything came to a head. I just hoped I was ready when it did. The evening had settled in by the time I returned to the brownstone. I'd spent the last few hours stewing in the city's chaos, piecing together everything I'd learned. The Carusos were up to something, but the question was always, what? The princess was no victim, and the closer I got to the heart of this tangled web, the more I realized how little I truly knew. Saul's warning echoed in my mind. You're in deeper than you think. But the more I thought about it, the clearer it became. The princess was the key, and if I was going to get answers, I'd have to go to the source. There was no way around it. I found Wolfe sitting in his chair, eyes half closed, as he carefully examined a plate of cheese and crackers. His face remained as inscrutable as always, but I knew by now when he was thinking, when his mind was working on something just out of reach. You've been gone longer than expected, he said, his voice calm but pointed. You learned something, I presume. I did, I replied, taking a seat across from him, but I'm not sure how much. Saul's digging turned up a few things. The Carusos have been planning something big. And I mean big, it's not just about the princess, not anymore. Wolfe put down the fork he had been holding, his gaze sharpening. Continue. Everyone's after power, Wolfe. The princess is a pawn, yes. But she's also playing the game. She's not trying to protect herself. She's positioning herself for something bigger. The Carusos want to be on the right side when whatever happens, happens. And I think they're preparing for a shift in the city's power structure. I'm not sure if it's political, business, or both, but someone higher up, is pulling the strings. Wolfe leaned back, folding his arms. And the letters. They are a key part of this plan. I nodded. They're more than just a message, Wolfe. They're leverage. Whoever controls them controls the outcome. Then it seems your task is clear, Archie. Wolfe's voice remained calm, but his eyes glinted with a sharp edge. You must retrieve those letters before they become a tool of far greater consequence. The silence between us grew heavy, filled with the weight of our conversation. I wasn't sure whether I was more exhausted from the chase or from the realization that everything I'd thought I knew was part of a much bigger game. I grabbed my coat and headed back out, this time with a single destination in mind. The princess. The answers had to come from her. I wasn't leaving until I had the full story. When I arrived at her apartment, I wasn't surprised to find the door already ajar. I'd been expecting it. The closer I got to the truth, the more I knew she'd be watching, waiting for me to make my move. I stepped inside, finding the princess standing by the window, gazing out at the city's skyline. She didn't turn when I entered, but I could feel her awareness settle in the air between us. "I knew you'd come back," she said, her voice soft but firm. "You've figured it out, haven't you?" "Not everything," I replied, moving closer, "but I'm getting there." "The letters, what's the real plan?" She turned to face me then, her eyes colder than I remembered. "You're right about one thing, Goodwin. I'm not a victim, but I'm not a villain either. I've played my part, and now I have to finish what I started." Her voice took on a more serious tone as she spoke. "The letters are a tool. But they're not just about me. They're about my family, my legacy. There's more at stake here than power. There's survival. If I lose control of those letters, if they fall into the wrong hands, everything I've built, everything my family has built, will fall apart. You have no idea what it's like to carry that weight." I took a step back, processing her words. This was more than just a game of ambition. It was a desperate attempt to control the narrative before it unraveled completely. "Who's really behind this, Princess?" I asked, my voice quiet. "Who else is involved?" She hesitated for a moment, then walked over to her desk, pulling a small envelope from one of the drawers. "It's not about one person, Mr. Goodwin. It's about the people who would destroy everything if they had the chance. My family's enemies. The ones who want to take what we've built and turn it into nothing." She handed me the envelope, her fingers brushing mine for the briefest of moments. "Take this. You'll understand when you read it." I glanced at the envelope, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on me. I knew this was it, the moment where everything would either fall into place or shatter completely. I opened the envelope, unfolding the letter inside. The words were brief, but they struck me hard. "We control the city's future. You either stand with us, or we bury you. Your father's legacy is nothing without our help." The handwriting was unmistakable, and the name at the bottom of the letter made my blood run cold. "Caruso," I whispered, realizing in that moment just how deep the conspiracy ran. Princess Livia stood silent as I pieced everything together. The Carusos had been orchestrating this whole charade, using her, manipulating her, all while playing their own game of power and control. And I had been caught in the middle, a pawn just like everyone else. I looked up at her, my mind racing. "So it was always them. You were just their tool, weren't you?" She nodded slowly. "But I'm no longer just a tool, Goodwin. I'm the one who decides how this ends. I've played my part, and now I have to protect what's mine." The room was heavy with the weight of the revelation. I wasn't sure what to do next, whether to call it in or let her handle things her way, but in that moment I knew one thing for certain. The game wasn't over. It was just beginning. I turned to leave, the letter burning a hole in my pocket. As I reached the door, I heard her voice again, softer this time. "You'll be fine, Goodwin. But remember, not all battles are won by the one who fights the hardest. Some are won by the one who knows when to step away." I nodded, stepping into the hallway, feeling the door close behind me. There were no easy answers, no simple resolutions, but in the world of power and manipulation, I had learned one final lesson. Sometimes, the best way to win is to let someone else think they've already won. 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 They've already